This week, we've obviously been talking about podcasting, and it's definitely revolutionized audio storytelling in a lot of the ways we've been talking about. But the industry itself has gone through its own evolution. Nick Quah is the editor of Hot Pod and actually the founder of Hot Pod Media. Hot Pod's a newsletter about the podcasting industry. Nick, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So, if the history of podcasting was almost this three-act play, I'd love to start in the early years and get your take on kind of where did it start? What characterized the early years of the podcasting industry?
So the early years of the podcasting industry was very much defined by the blogging metaphor. So a lot of the technology and the culture and the community that came out during that time were people who came from the RSS movement, anybody and everybody should publish. We need to sort of like fight the power kind of mentality. Dave Weiner is the person who worked on the original RSS feed, and so there was this like emerging community of hobbyists, technologists, people who were trying to find alternative ways to get around mainstream media. And so you had these communities of people essentially trying to write anything they want. And then now they had this sort of feeling that they could record anything they want and publish it out. According to a lot of people who came out during that time, they would admit that a lot of the stuff that they put out was not particularly good, nor was it well thought through. It's a lot of I'm driving in my car right now, I have these thoughts, I'm gonna record it, put it out there. But it really did come up from this place where like if you had an alternative view or a view that would not grant you access to mainstream media outlets, this would be a potential way, particularly in audio form, which kind of it opens up a different kind of discourse as opposed to something that's just a blog, which is one-way communication. At least you could have a conversation with two people, that kind of thing. And it kind of turned the corner around 2008, right? Like right before the recession, there was a sort of moment where NPR, public radio, started using it as a way to just ease up distribution, not just through broadcast, but over the internet. They're like, this is a possible technology to just get across and get more audiences. And then 2008 happens, and you have this sort of generation that interestingly came out right in the sort of heat of the recession. Bill Simmons started podcasting, Mark Maron started podcasting, Joe Rogan started podcasting, all these people that was like, I just wanted to have these extra spaces to do this kind of work. Maybe I was pushed up from my old job. And so, that became the feeling of this sort of second act. And then Serial happens in 2014. And by that time, there was these sort of emerging communities coming up. There was a lot of comedians that kind of used it as a space to access audiences if they cannot get stage time, if they weren't able to book television gigs. They sort of tried to build a following on podcasting. And there's just a ton of other hobbyists, a lot of more technology people, a lot of people doing TV recaps, film recaps, a lot of people doing experimental, interesting stuff. This American Life starts going on around 2006, 2007. So it's just all these sort of conglomerations of different kinds of people making stuff. But there was no real formalization.
Yeah, and where did we start to see the general public really start to listen? Like, when did it start to take off?
In hindsight, like really, if you just look at a chart of like aggregate monthly consumers, people who consider themselves monthly podcast listeners, 2014 did end up being an inflection point, but there were a few other inflection points before. A lot of it had to do with just structural technological distribution stuff. So Apple is the big player in these early days. You could definitely see a sort of a real market shift when Apple added podcasting to iTunes that really exposed it to mainstream. And then when they broke it out into a separate a standalone app on the iOS operating system. And that's also, you can also see now the shift because people go like, oh, what's this thing on my phone? It comes preloaded. I'm going to check out these things. Isn't this interesting? But I would argue, and there's a lot of people who would try to claim a narrative one way or the other, but it's sort of inarguable. In 2014, which two things happened. So Serial happens, but also Apple finally kind of just really kind of that's when they break it down to standalone app. And the two things added together was this flashpoint of an increased awareness of this one sort of driving phenomenal hit, and just access was so much more easier. And so that, I think, just supercharged these systems where people who were already making podcasts at the time started getting a lot more attention. The nascent advertisers who were buying onto podcasting kind of saw tremendous returns and started buying some more. And people, venture capitalists and capitalists are looking at the situation and kind of go, there's some heat here. Can I harness that energy? And so I would argue 2014 was the biggest inflection point up to this point. And one could make the argument that now we're in a fourth act, but that kind of breaks the storytelling metaphor, right? With Spotify coming in early 2019, but we can talk about that later.
No, let's move on to that because I really feel like we've been at this moment in the last couple of years where podcasting has felt like it's become a big business, with mergers and acquisition in the sense of like, how do we kind of do, what the MBAs would call the vertical integration so that,
Hmm.
somebody owns the ad technology, the creative house, the distribution platform like a Spotify and Gimlet. And I'm blanking on the name of the ad server or the ad system they bought.
Oh, Anchor.
Thank you. Thank you. And
Yeah.
that there's really this, vertical integration of, everything it takes to have a successful podcasting business. Is that your sense of what's been happening in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, the tricky thing is that there have been multiple times in the past
Yeah.
decade plus where, the media, whatever, it keeps saying like, oh, podcasting's now a thing. Isn't it weird? It's a thing now. But right now, it's unambiguously a thing. There are legitimate podcast millionaires, multimillionaires, 100 millionaires, and so you can't really look at that and kind of go like, I mean, it's kind of not a direct indicator, but it does show you that somebody or enough somebody's have evaluated the space enough that they're really sort of betting the farm on it, or some farmers. And so yes, Spotify I think is the first major like consolidator. So they did make multiple acquisitions around that stack as you're talking about. Not just content studios. We're seeing a bunch of other podcast acquisitions around content studios, Cadence 13, I Heard Media, but Spotify is really, it does feel like the first integrated attempt to just bottle that energy. And so
Yeah.
the metaphor and comparisons have been made that, Spotify looks like YouTube, or they look like they're going down the trajectory. And that's a fair argument. Whether that turns out to be the case, it is a thing that, it's more of a, what's a future casting question. But it's a concern as to if that doesn't end up being the case, what does that mean for everybody else? Do we see monopoly dynamics? If there are monopoly dynamics, what does resistance look like in this situation? What's independence look like in the situation? So we are well past is podcasting a thing now? Podcasting is a thing. The question is, what does it look like now?
How big of a thing is it? Like how much money is in this industry?
So from an audience perspective, it has been sort of found by Edison Research and corroborated by a bunch of other independent surveys that you could argue that a third of Americans can be considered active podcast consumers, not just one-offs or not just casual consumers, but people who have integrated into the media diet. From a money perspective, they're expecting, by they I mean sort of the podcast industry. There's no real trade organization, but there's been enough of these podcast companies that it can consolidate into individual studies. They're expecting to hit $1 billion in podcast advertising revenue by 2021. Of course, the pandemic has pushed that timeline a little bit back. I would argue that it's going to be a little bit closer to 2022. However, it does look like, we're 6 months into lockdown period, that podcast audiences have more than recovered. They've recovered plus at this point. So it's only a matter of time that advertisers kind of come back into the space and feel a bit more comfortable buying again. But from, 1 billion is, all things considered, not a ton of money if you really think about the larger scale of digital media. But it is the one growth space for a lot of these companies. So that's not insignificant.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And, now that it's become a thing and more of a big business, what are just some of the differences we see in the actual types of productions that folks are able to listen to?
We're seeing a lot of, this is a derogatory term, but it's a lot of sanitations happening. A lot of the sort of
Say what you mean by that.
So there's a sameness that sort of crept in now.
Yeah.
And it's, the classic thing that happens with when you mainstreamize an art form or a new media form, sort of the powers that be, big media companies that sort of buy into the space, they're trying to mainstreamize it to make it more mass marketable. And that kind of really almost always means either a betting on celebrities, betting on big names, or a standardization of the sound. And we're seeing quite a bit of standardization of the sound, particularly when it comes to things like interview shows and narrative documentary shows or narrative podcasts. A lot of the sort of core innovations or creative innovations of podcasting really comes up to the question of, what if you could take audio storytelling, whether it's an interview, chat show, or a narrative, break it from the time clock and just break it from a lot of traditional conventions? What if we took out signposting? What if we introduced new types of voices that nobody has ever heard before, and just hit those buckets again and again and again? That still exists, but the sort of bigger players that come into the space have largely kind of integrated traditional radio style storytelling, traditional television style storytelling into the space. And so you have this kind of there's less of a danger when you kind of pick up a podcast. It used to be the case. I sound like an old person, but like in 2010, 2011, when you kind of try out like a random show on the podcast charts, you might hear something that's really weird, and it could be offensive, and it could be just out there and scary. There's quite much less of that these days.
So sort of a homogenization. I mean, I think in the early days, there was definitely the sense, and I hear a lot of people bemoaning this, and I'm hearing a strain of this from you as well, that podcasting, is supposed to democratize media and take the power out of, the big owners of radio and television. I guess I'm curious, does that still happen? And did it ever really happen?
I would argue that, yes, it actually did happen, because there are two kinds of analyses you can do here, right? One is a sort of a power structure analysis. And from that perspective, it's like, the powers that be, the big corporate powers, venture capital firms, and all these places. It is the reality that a lot of the acquirers in podcast space are companies that were already big anywhere else. iHeartMedia, SiriusXM, NPR is not an acquirer, but it is a dominant force in the space. They were all big somewhere else. And now we're seeing Sony come into the space. We're seeing a lot of these traditional capital. You could argue that maybe Spotify is representative of a newer money, but at the same time, it's still part of an old power structure, because their ownership structure is really weird. Like Tencent owns part of it. It's Sony owns part of it. It's really weird. And so the question is sort of like, did it give opportunity both creatively from an audience perspective, and more importantly from a business ownership standpoint, to more people who otherwise would not have access to those opportunities in the past? And I think the answer is inarguably yes. You have a lot more people of color, a lot of more people of alternative views, being able to find audiences and build businesses that otherwise they could not have the opportunity to. There's a veritable, wing of podcasts around sort of left-wing, very leftist socialistic ideologies that could not have existed, like literally on YouTube necessarily, or on traditional broadcast radio. And so there's an argument to be made that there is a democratization. However, that sort of revolutionary radical openness of podcasting, when you meet that with the sort of capitalistic imperatives of building a business, raising money, being beholden to powers that have that money, you have this sort of encroaching and integration into these two things. So it leads us to a current situation where, yes, I sound like a massive Marxist theorist, so that's not my intention. But we're in a situation right now where you have a lot of these replication of power structures. You do have a lot of these old radio companies now having positions in the podcast space, but you do have spaces of new voices of resistance. And those are the places where it gets a little bit difficult in the narrative, because they're typically smaller and more niche, but very strong and deep communities. And when you tell a large macro story about a space, you tend to talk about the biggest players. That's just the way that we frame stories, right? Who's the most important person? And that does kind of obscure a lot of these smaller, more also meaningful spaces of new communities. And that should not be discounted in this narrative.
Can you give me a couple examples of some of those communities that you think have really formed around podcasting in ways that felt kind of impactful?
Yeah, so podcasting as a site of political media has been a really interesting trend that I've been sort of like really obsessed with for a couple of years now. And I think, it's very, because of the data and analytics side, it's hard to sort of numerize this, but there is a appreciable way in which podcasts like Chat with Trap House, for example, and the sort of galaxy of podcasts that it's inspired, has sort of really provided a really strong platform for Bernie Sanders supporters. Like there's a lot of spaces in which when you kind of hang out in left-wing forums or subreddits, that there are continuous citations of podcasts as one of their primary sources of media. And if you kind of really think about it, like they don't really have many other spaces to sort of derive information from. I can't really tell you what a noteworthy or a powerful left-wing blog is, or a website is, or a news sort of role is, or a television website, or a television station or a radio station. And so, there are spaces like that kind of keeps the ball rolling. There's a lot of people who are using podcasting right now as a way to get into television. That really sort of opens up different kinds of creators in the platforms. Previously, they would have to move to LA, deal with the high rent prices there, and maybe get an agent, maybe get noticed. But there has been this sort of trend where more Asians and more Black people and more people who were otherwise just artists and actors so struggling on their own, finding a way and now getting some development deals with smaller to mid-sized to occasionally large Hollywood studios. So that there's a lot of these things happening in the fringes. But there are secondary stories to this core story that we're talking about, which is where does the dominant business creation happen in podcasting? What is the dominant stories in business in podcasting? And that almost always has to do with either Apple, Spotify, iHeartMedia, SiriusXM, all these sort of traditional corporate players.
And we hear a lot about podcasting coming out of the US, Australia, England, UK, to some degree, Sweden has very high rates of podcast listening. Are there other parts of the world where it's really been a thing or had a real impact?
Well, I hear stories a lot of coming out of Germany, where Germany has sort of this really this strong consumer interest in on-demand audio specifically, and on-demand audio, and the way that it tends to get phrased to me is that, oh, this is sort of really weird underground stuff, and we really like it because apparently pop culture there is really driven by this notion of the underground. This is obviously a reductive sort of framing of German pop culture, but that seems to be that most of the emails that I get from that country is like, oh, we're finding some really interesting stuff here. And I think it's also germane to point out that Spotify is a Swedish company, and that a lot of their sort of findings and a lot of their experimental sort of data sets that informs their global strategy comes out of Europe. So it comes out of Germany. There's a story that they tell about how they notice German audiobook publishers uploading products onto Spotify, and that ends up being a place where they have built mass audiences. Sweden obviously has a sort of really deep culture of narrative audio documentary storytelling, and Spotify being a Swedish company, it's meaningful there. I'm also hearing stories coming out of Southeast Asia. I'm from Malaysia personally, and I would kind of contend that being a person who was born and raised there, we don't have a tradition of narrative audio storytelling. But I've heard that things are coming out from the Philippines and Indonesia that are meaningful now. And I think Spotify has a position in Indonesia where they are commissioning a bunch of exclusive programming that's audio narratives in Bahasa Indonesia, which is the language there. So there's a lot of stuff happening. There's an outfit out in the Middle East called SOUT. I'm actually not really how to pronounce it. It's SOWT. That has been sort of trying to create a culture and a community of audio storytelling. But again, the bulk of what's been coming out, my sense is, has been largely conversational, interview, talk show-ish. There's an entire argument that China has a massive podcast market, but a lot of it is more audible style, and a lot of it is pretty sort of governed by the media structures that exist there. So there's a lot going on. I hesitate to call them part of the podcast narrative necessarily, because I think, yes, to some extent, some places it's the podcast technology. Not all places. China's not they do not use the open podcast ecosystem. At the same time, in these other markets where they are using the podcast technology, there's no advertising market for it. So insofar as they're all part of this larger podcasting conversation, they're not necessarily part of the podcast industry conversation, which is still nascent in all these other spaces. And from a narrative perspective, I'm hesitant to impose sort of the American-centric view onto any of these individual markets, because they have to go their own path. They have to go their own path of business creation, entrepreneurship, and revenue.
So kind of coming back to the narrative arc here of the American podcast trajectory, and to some degree the rest of the English-speaking world, what do you think the next chapter is going to be? Like, where's this headed now?
It's not heading anywhere. We're in the middle of the fight. The story right now is a question of, will there only be monopoly? Will there only be Spotify? Will there only be, will the story of talent creation, art, entrepreneurship in podcasting largely be the story of, can you sign a deal with one of the bigs, right? And that makes it look a lot like the music industry, makes it look a lot like the television industry. My contention, and this is something that's not shared by everybody, is that the way that we should be framing these stories is, is there more business creation, full stop? Like, is there more capacities for people to build podcast companies that don't necessarily have to rely on a Spotify distribution deal or Apple necessarily to develop a viable business, a sustainable business? And the thing is that also these are entrenched in larger narratives about how we tell stories about businesses in America. We're not talking about businesses to be sold for hundreds of millions of dollars. We're not talking about businesses to be built so that they can make millions and millions of dollars. We're just talking about sustainable businesses, media businesses, full stop. And this is happening in a larger media context of, like, there are very few small to mid-sized media businesses. There are very few local newspapers now. And so is podcasting, with tools that we can see it with the entrepreneurship and innovation that can pop up, will it only be driving us to this direction of advertising consolidation? Or can we find alternative business models to build small to mid-sized businesses that do not have to play the monopoly game in order to live? And I think that's the story that we find ourselves in right now. And part of that story involves the question of, will Spotify be YouTube? And that's they will tell you no. They will tell you that we are benevolent overlords. But that's just everybody's the hero of their own story. So that's the problem here.
Yeah. And what's your biggest hope and what's your biggest fear for where things could go?
Look, I'm a pessimist by nature, and so like I'm pretty sure that this is going to end up being a monopoly space. And my hope is that people don't be disheartened. My hope is that, like, artists, producers, creators, journalists, they look at podcasting and they look at what's happening in Spotify and corporatization and capitalism, and they don't say like that just means that I'm not going to play this game. Like, oh, if the world is impure. The reality is that we live with the contradictions of capitalism. There, as much as there's this potential for democratization and true innovation and true liberation from a storytelling and from a communications and media perspective, you're still going to have to play ball with how the money flows. You have to pay the bills, you have to pay rent. And so, like, you got to identify spaces in which, like, all right, we're going to make certain trade-offs. Something, maybe we will have a partnership deal with our hit media Spotify once in a while, but always prioritize that people will continue prioritizing business ownership and, like, to really retain control and independence over the decisions that they make, that they won't have to say, like, I'm not going to be able to say this thing because I'm afraid of scaring an advertiser, scaring Spotify, or scaring Apple or whatever. My hope is that more people play the pragmatic game of building a business in America while retaining the ideals of what these businesses can do, which is to really open up conversations, to really build spaces of discourse that didn't previously exist. Like, personally, right now, I'm listening to this podcast that just came into my life called Time to Say Goodbye. And it's the first time that I heard three Asian American scholars, really intelligent, really sharp thinkers about race, contextualize Asian American identity for me in a way that I kind of felt did not exist. I could not find anywhere else. If somebody wrote about it in New York Times op-ed pages, I would be frustrated because it would be so whitewashed. And they're not making any money off it, but they do drive it to other forms of revenue for them. And that, that would not exist anywhere else. And it's things like that kind of made me keep reminding me, like, there's potential. There will always be potential for as long as, like, we breathe. There will be potential.
So, advice time for the students in the class who are interested in audio storytelling and thinking about podcasting, perhaps. What advice do you have for them as they think about what they might want to do in this space?
My advice is learn how to build spreadsheets. Like, everybody, if you want to be an artist, like, to be able to utter this following sentence, which is, I don't really want to think about the business side of things. I just want to make my own, tell my stories, is the height of privilege. If you want to be free in this world, you have to fight to be free in this world. And fighting means knowing how the system works and knowing how to find your place and build your position and strengthen your position in that system. And that always means knowing where the money is coming from. And that always means, like, when you say yes to somebody, when you say, yes, I will work with a public radio station to work on this, or yes, I will take advertising, that there's a trade-off, and that there will always be a trade-off. Nobody's pure in this world. And you need to know how to play with the money in order to know how to reach people and tell audiences on your own terms, because nobody's going to give you that. You're going to have to fight for it. So that's my advice. Get a lawyer, get an accountant, learn how to read spreadsheets.
Excellent. Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
My pleasure.
I'd love for you to just let folks know, where could they find your newsletter?
So you can find my newsletter at hotpotnews.com. It's also syndicated on Vulture. So if you want to just see the free versions, you can check out vulture.com. I just want to shout out two things. One is that I have a podcast, like many other people nowadays.
Of course you do.
Servant the Pod. It's a show with LA Studios, which is the podcast arm of KPCC. And I just launched a podcast recommendations newsletter for Vulture, hoping to really sort of open up sort of discovery of, like, it's not just the big players, it's not just Gimlets or whatever. We're also going to talk about small guys too. And it's called 1.5 Speed. You can find that on vulture.com as well.
Great. And Nick's newsletter is fantastic if you're trying to keep tabs on the industry. So it's a great resource.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure.